So this is an interesting type of market. It's called an oligopoly, okay? And traditionally there's just two or three firms in the market. We kind of just use two, in some of the games we play when we look at this. There are several big markets that have two dominant firms. Not necessarily the only two firms, but two dominant firms. Some of the ones that you may have heard of are like Coke and Pepsi. Coke and Pepsi own a very, very large market share of the soft drink industry. They own, Coke owns Powerade, and Pepsi owns Gatorade, and Coke does, Sprite, and Pepsi does 7 Up, and they have Coke Zero and Pepsi whatever, and so they're all the same thing, and they're always competing against each other. Probably the biggest ones in the world, the biggest oligopic market in the world that I could think of is probably the market for airplanes. Boeing is the biggest American manufacturer of airplanes. Obviously, and when I'm making this, it's during COVID. That's been hurt really badly. But Boeing in America, and then in Europe, Airbus. Boeing and Airbus make a gigantic portion of the passenger jets that are sold in the world, and they survive an oligopic market. Okay. Now, in an oligopic market, with only having two or three firms, it's very, very, very difficult to enter the market. Another really important part of an oligopic market is that the decisions of each individual firm tend to be based not just what's best for that firm, but it tends to be based on the behavior of the competition. And we usually use an idea, oligopic firms often employ game theory as a way to decide what would be the best decision for their firm. Now, there are plenty of small town oligopic markets, and that's what we'll do here, and sort of play around with some game theory. But I want to show you what that means, oligopolies, and how it's hard to enter the market. They usually make a pretty good profit. And the big thing is that their decisions are based on their competition. So I've got two firms here. I've got Smith Salads and Keller's Kale, okay? And let's say these are the two, healthy restaurant firms in a town. And let's say that these two want to decide, they're trying to figure out whether they should advertise or not. And so they're going to try to decide whether they should advertise based on what the other one does. And so we use what looks kind of like a Punnett square to those of you who've had biology and looking at genetic stuff. We're going to have Smith Salad over on this side and Keller's Kale over here. In each one of these quadrants, which I've labeled A, B, C, and D, in each one of these quadrants, the number on the left, this first number, is associated with Smith Salads, and the number on the right is associated with Keller's Kale. Okay? And these numbers represent the profit that they can make by doing each one of these behaviors. So, for example, in quadrant A, if Smith Salad advertises and Keller's Kale advertises, Smith will make $300 and Keller will make $200. If in B, Smith does not advertise, she'll make $400. And if Keller advertises while she's not advertising, Keller makes $400. Okay? And then over here in C, if Smith doesn't advertise and Keller doesn't advertise, it'd be $200 and $500. And then if Smith advertises and Keller doesn't, Smith will make $300 and Keller will make $300 also. We need to figure out what they're going to do, because their decisions will be based on their competition's decision. Okay? So the way that I do this is, let's cover up this side first. And let's just look at Smith. Well, here, Smith can, so if Keller advertises, Smith can advertise and make $300 or not advertise and make $400. Well, if Keller decides to advertise, Smith will decide not to advertise because $400 is greater than $300. So Keller advertising means Smith won't advertise. Okay, well, let's look at it this way. If Keller decides not to advertise, Smith can advertise and make $300 or not advertise and make $200. So in this case, if Keller does not advertise, then Smith will choose to advertise because 300 is more than 200. So in this case, you can see over here Smith will not advertise, but up here Smith will advertise, which means there is no what we call dominant strategy. All right, so for Smith Salads, there is no dominant strategy because her decision is based on what Keller will do. Okay, well, now let's look and see what Keller's going to do. So let's say that that Smith decides to advertise. If Smith advertises, remember Keller is the second number in each quadrant. Smith advertises, Keller can advertise and make 200, or Keller cannot advertise and make 300. Well, 300 is greater than 200, so Keller is going to not advertise. Same thing if Keller decides if Smith decides not to advertise, Keller can advertise and make 400, or not advertise and make 500. So if Smith decides not to advertise, Keller will also not advertise because 500 is greater than 400. So you can see here, doesn't Keller have a dominant strategy? Keller will always not advertise regardless of what Smith does. So in this case, the dominant strategy of Keller's kale is to not advertise. So now we got to figure out what's each one of them going to do. Well, the funny part about it is they're going to end up being in quadrant D. You're like, well, it makes sense. Wouldn't it be better for Smith to not advertise over here and make 400 and Keller to not advertise over here and make 500? That would, except she's only making $400 here if Keller is advertising. But Keller's not going to advertise. And Keller is only making $500 over here if Smith decides not to advertise. But if Keller decides not to advertise, then Smith will. So this is where they're going to end up. So you can see game theory teaches us that when we look at the behavior of our competition, then we fall into a very predictable pattern. So instead of using curves, in this case, we're using game theory to look at how behavior becomes predictable under these circumstances, right? Now, if we change the numbers, then that might change who does what. I'm going to have another example of this so you can kind of watch me do it again and watch it over and over. The first time I did this, I was really bad at it. I'm spatially not very smart. I don't have very good spatial intelligence. And a lot about this is just sort of seeing how this works and playing around with it. So if you want to watch it a couple times, that's fine. This is a really cool part. If we're in school, I'll arrest some of you and we'll do a prisoner's dilemma. That is another good example of this. But this is how game theory works, and this is how some of those oligopoly firms make their decisions.